Schools are meant to be places of learning and laughter, but once the sun sets, these buildings transform into labyrinths of shadows and echoes from the past. Many janitors and night staff have reported the same thing, the feeling that, even though the classrooms are officially empty, the class never truly ends for everyone. Today, I bring you 4 chilling stories that took place in the silent hallways of schools, hiding dark secrets. From chairs that move on their own to recesses that last an eternity. Turn off the lights, stay quiet, and get ready. Because today the lesson is one of terror. Working as a night assistant at a school has its perks. The pay is decent, and most of the time I just have to sit in the front office, make sure all the lights are off and the doors are locked. The building is old, with high ceilings and wooden floors that creak as the temperature changes. My shift begins at 10 p.m., just as the last teachers and janitors leave. At 11:30 p.m., I did my usual rounds. Everything was calm. The library was silent, the chemistry lab smelled of formaldehyde, and the high school hallways were empty. I double-locked the main door and returned to the office to finish some reports. Around 1:30 a.m., while checking the security cameras, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't subtle. It was a dry, heavy thud coming directly from the ceiling of my office, the classroom right above me on the second floor. Clunk. It sounded like a metal table had been flipped over. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing. I hurried up the stairs, thinking a shelf had collapsed or an intruder had entered through a window. When I reached the second floor hallway, the air felt strangely thick, heavy with the smell of old chalk and dampness. I walked toward the math classroom, located exactly above my office. Before I could even touch the doorknob, the sound started again, but this time it was steady and deliberate. Squeak, squeak. It was the unmistakable sound of metal chair legs dragging across the granite floor. It wasn't an accidental fall. I could hear one chair being dragged, then another and another, moving in circles all over the room. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand, because I had locked that room myself just 2 hours earlier, and the room was technically empty. I took a breath and inserted the key into the lock. The sound of the chairs stopped the exact moment the door mechanism clicked. I threw the door open, flooding the room with my flashlight. The classroom was in perfect order. The chairs were lined up behind the desks, exactly as the students had left them. There were no open windows, no drafts, and no one hiding under the tables. However, when I lowered my flashlight to the floor, my blood ran cold. In the dust gathered on the granite floor, there were fresh marks, long, circular furrows indicating that the chairs had indeed been moved violently seconds before. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut. Despite there being no draft, I turned around terrified, but before I could react, the sound started again. But this time, it wasn't on the floor. The sound of dragging chairs was coming from the ceiling. I looked up and heard dozens of pieces of furniture being dragged in unison on the 3rd floor, following my footsteps. I realized then it wasn't an intruder. It was something moving with me, 1 floor above, tracking my position in the dark. I ran out of there, taking the stairs 2 at a time. As I fled toward the exit, the thunder of chairs on the upper floors followed me with surgical precision, as if an entire class of ghosts were running over my head, chasing me to the door. I reached the ground floor office gasping, my chest burning from the effort. I locked the door and pressed myself against it, waiting to hear the impact of chairs on my ceiling one more time. But it didn't happen. The school plunged into an absolute silence, a silence that hurt. Trying to calm down, I looked back at the security monitors. My eyes scanned the hallway cameras, empty and grey. But when I looked at the camera for the math classroom where I had just been, I saw something that made me doubt my sanity. On the monitor, the classroom was no longer in order. All the chairs were piled in the center of the room, forming a tall, precarious structure reaching almost to the ceiling. And worst of all, on the green chalkboard, someone or something was writing. No one was in front of the board, but the scraping of the chalk was audible through the camera's microphone. Crack, crack, crack. The chalk moved on its own, tracing large, shaky letters. When it finished, the chalk fell to the floor and shattered. On the board, I could clearly read my name, followed by one word, present. I felt the air leave my lungs. Right at that moment, the chair in my own office, the one right behind me, moved a few inches. It was a soft scrape, a small metal squeak on the floor. I turned slowly, but the chair was empty. However, when I looked back at the office security monitor, the screen showed a dark, translucent figure sitting right behind my desk, with one hand resting on my shoulder. I left the school that very instant and didn't even go back for my jacket. The next day, I sent my resignation by email. The principal asked no questions. He simply replied, "We understand. You are not the first." Ever since, whenever I hear furniture dragging on the floor above me at home, I freeze, fearing that someone, somewhere, is still calling roll. I've only been working as a janitor at this high school for a month. My shift starts when everyone leaves, and my job is to leave the hallways spotless for the next day. It's a lonely job, but I liked the peace, or so I thought, until it was my turn to clean the old locker wing. It was past 2 a.m., and I was mopping the long second-floor hallway. The only sound was the damp mop hitting the floor until I heard a sob. It was a faint cry like that of a small child, appearing to come from the walls. I stopped, and the crying turned into a broken whisper. "Hello? Did someone get locked in?" I asked, setting my cleaning bucket aside. No one answered, but the sound became clearer. It was coming from the middle of the hallway, specifically behind the metal door of locker 137. I leaned in and pressed my ear against the cold metal. I didn't just hear crying. There was also a rhythmic scratching, as if someone were using their nails to try and claw through the door from the inside. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I searched my belt for the master keys they give the cleaning staff. My hands were sweating. I found the small locker key, inserted it into the lock, and just as I was about to turn it, the crying stopped dead, and a very small voice, pressed against the other side of the metal, told me, "Don't open it, he's still out here with you." I froze with the key still in the lock. The air in the hallway, which was always warm from the central heating, turned ice cold in an instant. My eyes scanned the empty hallway, looking for the voice spoke of, but I only saw the fluorescent lights flickering at the end of the corridor. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized I was completely exposed in the middle of that endless hall. Despite the warning, the instinct to help was stronger than my fear. I thought maybe a student had been trapped by a cruel prank and was delirious from the confinement. With a quick, clumsy motion, I turned the key and pulled the metal door. The locker creaked open, echoing through the whole building, but what I saw inside made no sense at all. Locker 137 was empty of any human presence. There was no child, only an old, faded backpack covered in a layer of dust, so thick it looked like ash. What stopped my heart was seeing deep scratch marks on the inside of the door, as if someone had tried to dig through the steel until their nails wore away. I dropped my keys as I felt the weight of the atmosphere shift. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a violent bang on the next locker over. 138. Bam! The metal door dented from the inside, as if something invisible had struck it with inhuman force. Then 139 flew open and slammed shut with a force that nearly broke the hinges. I began to back away, tripping over my own cleaning bucket, as I watched every locker in the hallway start opening and slamming shut in a frantic, violent sequence. The noise was deafening, a symphony of metal clashing against metal that seemed to follow a rhythm of pursuit. Amidst the din, I heard the child's voice again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a warning scream that thundered in my ears. "Run, he saw you." I didn't need to hear anything else. I left the mop and the cleaning gear behind and bolted toward the emergency stairs. As I ran, I felt the floor vibrating beneath my feet. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a tall, deformed shadow, a silhouette that looked like it was made of pure darkness, emerging from one of the open lockers at the end of the hall and moving toward me with unnatural speed. I reached the stairwell door and slammed it shut with all my might, blocking it with my own body as I heard dull thuds on the other side. They weren't hand knocks, they were heavy blows, as if something solid and massive were ramming the wood. I prayed every prayer I knew until the banging ceased and only the echo of the child's crying remained, fading into the distance. The next morning, when the day shift arrived, they found my bucket overturned and the hallway flooded with water. But what made me quit right then and there was what they found in locker 137. The old backpack I had seen was gone, and in its place was a small note written in chalk on the back of the metal that read, "Thank you for opening it. Now he has a new hiding place." Working the night shift as a cleaning assistant has moments of deep loneliness, but nothing compares to the gymnasium section. It is a massive space with soaring ceilings that amplify any noise and a persistent smell of rubber and old sweat. It was almost 3 a.m. when I entered to give the varnished wooden floor one last pass with the industrial mop. I turned on only a couple of rows of lights to save energy, leaving the ends of the court submerged in deep darkness. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the squeak of my shoes on the parquet. I began to mop from the center towards the exit, focused on leaving the floor shiny, when a dry, rhythmic sound made me stop dead in my tracks. Thump, thump. It was the unmistakable sound of a basketball bouncing against the wooden floor. The echo bounced off the empty bleachers, making it hard to tell exactly where it was coming from. I stood motionless, gripping the mop handle tightly, hoping it was just the ventilation system or some pipe, but the rhythm was too human, too constant. "Is anyone there?" I shouted, my voice getting lost in the vastness of the gym. "It's no longer time for practice. I have to close up." The bouncing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so heavy that I felt a pressure in my ears, just as I was about to resume my task. An old leather ball rolled slowly out of the darkness at the far end of the court, stopping right on the wet patch I had just cleaned. It was completely soaked, leaving a trail of dirty water in its wake. Intrigued and annoyed, I walked toward the back to see who had thrown it. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach churn. Near the entrance to the showers, the floor I had left spotless seconds before was marked. They were barefoot prints, small like a child's, but dark in color, as if they were made of mud or stagnant water. The tracks didn't come from the main door. They came directly from the floor drains in the showers, which were padlocked shut. They were wet, heavy marks advancing in a straight line toward the center of the court, right toward where I was standing. The most terrifying part was that the prints appeared one by one before my eyes, as if someone invisible were walking toward me at that very moment. I recoiled instinctively, tripping over the wet ball that had rolled earlier. Upon touching it, I felt that it wasn't water covering it. It was something viscous and cold that smelled of river sludge. I looked up and saw that the mud tracks stopped just 3 feet from my feet. The air in the gym became so cold that my breath began to form a small cloud of vapor in front of my face. Then, the ball on the floor suddenly jumped, as if someone had given it a violent kick. It went flying toward the upper bleachers, disappearing into the darkness of the ceiling. A second later, from high up by the hoops, I heard a muffled, wet laugh, followed by the sound of something heavy sliding down the metal beams, coming straight down toward where I was. The sound of metal sliding over my head forced me to back against the wall, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. The cold was now unbearable, a cold that seemed to seep from the very pores of the wooden floor. The mud tracks that had stopped in front of me began to multiply. It was no longer just one pair of feet. Now there were dozens of small, erratic marks surrounding my position, as if an invisible crowd were running in circles around me. Suddenly, the ball that had flown into the bleachers fell again, but this time it didn't bounce. It landed with a dry, heavy thud, as if it was filled with lead, right in the center of the circle of footprints. Looking at the ball under the dim light, I saw it was no longer leather. Its surface had transformed into something resembling human skin, pale and wrinkled, covered in that same viscous substance that flooded the air with the smell of stagnant water and rot. A metallic crash made me jump. The shower doors, which I had personally checked were locked, swung wide open. The sound wasn't that of a lock breaking, but of metal twisting. From inside the locker rooms, a tide of thick, black water began to pour out, quickly flooding the gym floor, erasing my cleaning trail and covering the mud marks with a layer of liquid darkness. I felt a violent tug at the hem of my pants. Looking down, a small, grayish hand with extremely long fingers and black, muddy nails was emerging from the black water that already reached my ankles. It wasn't a child's hand, but something deformed, imitating that shape. The grip was ice cold, as if I were being held by shards of ice, and it began to pull me with supernatural force toward the darkness of the showers. I fought to break free, using the mop to strike at the water, but the liquid felt dense, as if it had a life of its own. Then, from the shadows of the locker rooms, a figure emerged. It was tall, hunched, with limbs that were too long, propping itself on both the floor and the walls. It had no face, only a large vertical slit in the center of what should be its head, from which emanated that constant, bouncing sound I had heard at the beginning. The creature let out a scream that sounded like the echo of 1,000 balls bursting at once. In that instant, the remaining lights exploded, plunging the gym into absolute blackness. I could only hear the splashing of the black water approaching, and the scraping of those metal claws against the parquet floor. I crawled across the floor, guided by instinct, searching for the emergency exit while feeling several wet hands trying to grab my shoulders and neck. I managed to reach the emergency door bar and pushed it with all my weight. Stepping out into the cold night air, the sound of the gym cut off sharply, as if a tomb had been closed. I stood there, trembling under the moonlight, staring at my hands covered in that black sludge that refused to dry. When I returned with the supervisor half an hour later, the gym was completely dry. There was no trace of black water, no mud tracks, and no wet balls. The wooden floor shone under the halogen lights, impeccable. However, as we approached the showers to lock them, we saw something the supervisor couldn't explain. Every mirror in the locker rooms was covered, from top to bottom, by hundreds of small, wet handprints that looked as if they had been pounding on the glass from the inside, trying to get out. It was a professional development Monday, one of those days when there are no students in school and the silence becomes almost artificial. My task as a cleaning assistant was to take advantage of the children's absence to wash down the central courtyard and clean the play areas. Without the usual hustle and bustle, the building felt immense, like a sleeping giant exhaling cold air through the empty hallways. It was 11 a.m., the exact time when the courtyard usually explodes with shouts and running. I was connecting the hose to the water outlet when I heard it for the first time. A sharp, crystalline laugh. At first I didn't give it much thought, thinking a neighbor might have children playing in the garden next door, but the sound didn't come from outside. The echo bounced clearly between the walls of the inner courtyard. I stopped and turned off the water to listen better. Silence returned for a few seconds, but then it was replaced by the sound of quick footsteps, like school shoes hitting the concrete in a desperate race. There were several children. I could swear it by the cluttered sound of the footsteps. Tap, 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 tap. The sound traveled the perimeter of the courtyard and stopped right behind the large swing set structure. "Is anyone there?" I asked, leaving the hose on the ground. "There shouldn't be any children on campus today. Please come out." No one answered with words. Instead, I heard a collective whisper, a murmur of children's voices sharing a secret. The sound was so clear that I felt if I walked a couple more steps, I would see a group of hidden kids. I approached the playground area, but as I rounded the swings, there was absolutely nothing. Only the wind gently moving one of the rusted chains. That's when the atmosphere shifted. The sun, which had been shining brightly, seemed to lose its warmth. Suddenly, the sound of an old metallic bell, the kind no longer used in the school, rang out with deafening force. Clang, clang, clang. It was the signal for the end of recess, but the sound didn't come from the modern speakers. It came from an invisible point in the center of the courtyard. Immediately after the bell, the laughter turned into weeping. The courtyard, which had been empty a moment ago, filled with shadows passing at full speed across the edge of my vision. They weren't people. They were blurry, dark stains running toward the ground floor classrooms, leaving behind a trail of cold that made the hair on my arms stand up. One of those shadows stopped for a moment in front of me, and I felt an icy whisper that froze my blood. "Teacher, the door is locked, and the smoke won't let us out." I stood petrified in the middle of the courtyard, the echo of that whisper burning in my ears. The mention of smoke made no sense on such a clear day, but suddenly, the air began to grow thick and smell of burnt wood and melting plastic. I looked toward the ground floor classrooms and saw that the window panes, which I had cleaned myself that morning, were now fogged from the inside, as if dozens of small hands were pressing against the glass, leaving desperate finger marks sliding down. The children's laughter I had heard at the beginning turned into a chorus of wailing and blunt thuds against the locked doors of the rooms. I felt a surge of panic seeing that the dark shadows running through the courtyard were no longer blurry. Now they were defined silhouettes of children in old-fashioned uniforms, their faces covered in grayish ash. They were all running in the same direction, toward the old auditorium that now served as a cleaning storage room, screaming names I didn't recognize. I remembered then an old newspaper clipping I had seen in the archives office about an incident decades ago, long before the school was remodeled. In the 1970s, a boiler failure during a festival day had caused a fast-moving fire in the north wing. Although the official story said everyone had made it out in time, the atmosphere surrounding me told a much more sinister and painful version. The courtyard wasn't just a place for games. It was the place where many had stayed, waiting for help that never came. Suddenly, one of the wooden doors of the storage room flew off its hinges without anyone touching it. From the darkness of the threshold, a blast of hot, ash-laden air hit my face, forcing me to back away and cover my eyes. Opening them, I saw a small boy standing at the entrance of the storage room. His uniform impeccable, but his eyes completely white. He reached his hand out to me, holding an old scorched rag ball, and with a voice that vibrated with the echo of 1,000 years, he asked if I wanted to play with them forever. Terror gave me the strength I needed to react. I dropped the hose, which was still leaking a weak stream of water, and ran toward the school's main exit. As I crossed the courtyard, I felt shadows trying to grab my ankles and heard their laugh, now distorted and metallic, turn into a deafening roar that made the building's walls shake. I didn't stop until I crossed the outer gate, where the afternoon sun felt warm again and the air regained its purity, leaving the smell of burning behind. I leaned against the outer wall, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. Looking through the bars of the gate, back into the empty courtyard, everything seemed normal. There was no smoke, no shadows, no screams. However, right in the center of the courtyard, where there had been nothing before, I saw the old, burnt rag ball rolling slowly across the ground, stopping right in front of the auditorium entrance. I realized then that there are recesses that never end, and for some students, the dismissal bell will never ring. After hearing these stories, it's hard not to look at those dark hallways with suspicion the next time you pass by a school at night. Some presences remain etched into the walls, waiting for someone to make the mistake of staying past the final bell. If you've ever seen something inexplicable at your school, share it in the comments. I'd love to read it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next night shift. And remember, if you hear a ball bouncing in an empty gym, it's better not to go and see who's playing.